Hello and welcome to the Sonic Cinema Podcast. My name is Brian Scuttle. Thank you for joining me at www.sonic-cinema.com, as well as the Sonic Cinema Podcast YouTube channel. You can subscribe, rate, and review the podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, whether that is on the YouTube channel or at Apple, Google, Spotify, Good Pods. It's pretty much available wherever podcasts are available. Check us out. Check out earlier episodes. One of the things you will find through some of these episodes is that previous episodes might have clues into current episodes, especially when it comes to returning guests like today. And I'm looking forward to this discussion. But click subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also check us out at patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. A lot of big stuff happening. All of my Renegade coverage has been up for the past couple weeks, and whether it's Q&A excerpts, whether that's short film block reviews, Renegade gave me a lot, and it always gives me a lot. And we will hopefully be covering the Atlanta Film Festival in April, so that will be more of the same. You can also check out Leaving the Collection as well as Life Soundtrack, and that is at patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. So it's funny because of the fact that this is a filmmaker. My guest today is a filmmaker whom I met at Women in Horror in 2020. She's been on the podcast before. We talked later in 2020. And it feels like I've talked to her pretty much every year, whether for the podcast or for other things, about film-related subjects. And I mean, not just in terms of writing about her work or talking about her work, but just talking about films. And we're going to be talking about a filmmaker that both of us greatly admire, and I think both of us share connection to in a lot of different ways, and that is Darren Aronofsky. And joining me on the podcast is, like I said, return guest. She is a filmmaker whom I met at that first Women in Horror Film Festival. We've known each other ever since. It's been great to see her at Renegade the past couple of years, and she just debuted the Black Lake Director's Cut a couple weeks ago after this year's Renegade, and her film Maya is going to be playing at the Salem Film Festival coming up. Please welcome back to the podcast K11. Kay, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you, Brian. Always a pleasure. Such an honor to be here with you.
And one of the things that it's weird because of the fact that I've kind of gotten to this point where once I have you on, if you're a filmmaker, if I've had you on in terms of a larger discussion of your work, I'm like, okay, I think I want to have this person on to talk about somebody else's work now. And you are somebody whom, based on our interactions online, based on our discussions, whom I've definitely wanted to have on to discuss different filmmakers. And first of all, I've already teed up, what's going on as far as Black Lake, as far as Maya. But do you have anything else to add with regards to what's going on with those?
Do you mean where they're at? How people can see them, Brian, or what do you mean?
Yeah, I mean, basically, if there's any place coming up that people are going to be able to see them, or just where, basically what's going on with you as a filmmaker.
Sure. So I just screened. We did the world premiere of the Black Lake Director's Cut in Atlanta while I was there, just after Renegade, which was amazing. I had to share it with you guys first. So the plans for that, I'm only willing to submit that to maybe 3 or 4 film festivals for 2024. So this year, it's very unlikely people will get to see the Director's Cut of Black Lake. The focus this year is still very much on Maya, which will be screening at Salem Horror Fest, and I'm waiting to hear back from 2 more festivals. for Maya. And so what I'm hoping is by the end of 2024, Maya and Black Lake will be off the festival circuit and just wrapped up, hopefully with a distributor. If not, I do have plans to self-release those in a really groovy kind of way. So that is the plan. It's just got to that point now where I miss some festivals and I kind of want to get them out, but I'm also at this stage where I'm not interested in submitting to every and any film festival. I want to look at which audiences could potentially connect well with those films and only go to those festivals, especially with the director's cut of Black Lake, you know? And the plan is basically from this November is to be fully focused and moving forwards with my third feature film, Vessel. That is the plan. So I hope very much to be in Pakistan filming the most dangerous parts of the shoot and perhaps the most important. Then I can kind of worry about the other stuff next year. So that is what is happening.
Okay. Yeah. And, it's like one of those things that I think I do want to talk about that a little bit with regards to film festivals and in terms of how you decide whether to submit to as much as possible or whether just to specify. Because I mean, your films are very distinctive. We talked about it a bit a couple of years ago when it came to Black Lake with Maya. We talked about it a little bit more, but you've very much talked about being on this journey, the spiritual journey, and we've had several discussions about this, and one of the things that I find I'm just kind of curious, especially with a particular genre that you specialize in, which is horror. What is kind of the what makes it more of a priority to show Black Lake and Maya in specific film festivals as opposed to just getting as much, because you would think most filmmakers would want just as much coverage as possible.
Yeah. I think it's interesting because I think with my first attempts with the original cut of Black Lake and the original cut of Maya back in 2015, that was my approach: submit everywhere, anywhere. And I realized, you know what? That's actually not the right approach for me. As a teacher, I actually taught a class today on, when you go in for a job interview, it's not just about being chosen for that job. It's about sitting there and thinking, is this job right for me? Are those people representing me well? And in the past 3 years, I found that I've had to withdraw from certain festivals because I'm not particularly happy about the ethics. And I feel like, especially in the horror genre, certain horror film festivals, unfortunately, are not run by very nice people. So things like that I find very problematic, especially as my films are so heavily based on social justice. So I want to be represented well on the festival circuit. It's not even about just putting it out there, showing it to an audience, but I want the right people. I want to meet the right people. And that involves doing a bit of research beforehand on people running festivals, on the kind of people that attend. I mean, my films they're like my babies, and it's like choosing the right school. You want to make sure they're interacting with the right people and being connected with by an audience that cares somewhat in that particular way.
Yeah, I mean, I know you and I we talked a bit when you were down in Atlanta in the fall last year, and one of the things that when it comes to finding that audience, it's like not only is it important to make sure that the audience that we feel like, especially for artists, we find the audience that is right for our projects, whether it's films, whether it's podcasts, whether it's music, whatever. Like you said, it's our baby. It's a part of us we are putting out to the world. It also matters, what am I doing to find, what's important to me is find the audience that not only will appreciate it, but might get something more out of it too. And I think that's one of the things that, as a creative individual that we all need to strive for, really, in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And it's about, I've finally come to a place, Brian, where I don't take it personally. For example, and you know what? My day job as a teacher also helps this. I teach, and there are times where I have to tell students, if I am not the right teacher for you, feel free to change your class, because we all have different styles. And, I guess it's similar to paying for a ticket to see a movie. Some people are after something very specific. And if I'm not giving you that, then, go and watch something else. So I trying really hard not to take it personally. And I know my work is quite triggering. I know it's very different, and some people are not ready for it. They might never be ready for it, and that is fine.
And that actually makes a very good segue to the filmmaker that we are discussing today. Because it is 25 years ago that this filmmaker first came onto the scene with his debut film, Pi. And his latest film actually just came out in this past year and won 2 somewhat controversial Academy Awards for Best Actor and Best Makeup, which we will discuss that later. When, it's like one of the things, especially if one of the things I've definitely started to do, there are some times where I have a subject in mind for a podcast and I'm trying to fit a guest with that subject. I've had that in times. But with you, when I first approached you about having you on the podcast, if there are times where it's like, well, what are you interested in talking about? Who are you interested in talking about? And you're the one who brought up Aronofsky. What is it about his work where it resonates with you so much?
So this is going to be a really interesting conversation, Brian, because I feel like I've done a bit of a U-turn. So, I was thinking about Darren Aronofsky's filmography, and actually, when we got The Whale here at London Film Festival, I saw it then. And it was an incredible experience. And I never thought Darren Aronofsky could actually be there with the writer. So he actually came up on stage and said a few words. Oh gosh, the writer's gone out of my head. Samuel Hunter. So they were both there, and they introduced the movie, and that was nice. It gave me a bit of a kind of some background notes on the film. I went in there blind, just knowing Brendan Fraser was in it. And there must have been over 1,000 people in that auditorium. And I have never heard people cry so audibly. I usually cry. I always cry, but I could hear people crying. Now, that was a really interesting experience for me, because through my interaction with that film, I realized just how much I had changed. And I hate to say it, but I realized just how ordinary, in a way, Darren Aronofsky was. When he stood up on stage, I was like, oh, I'm a bit underwhelmed by his presence. And that really caught me off guard. And I thought, and I recently redid my top 50 films of all time. And these are not my favorite films. These are films I consider to be exceptional.
Yeah.
And I was really surprised when I took out Black Swan. It is a film I have loved, I have stuck by, I have lost friends over, Brian, because of how much I defended that movie. And I realized when I watched The Whale, I sat there and I thought, I have changed. I have changed. And then I recently, just a couple of months ago, when I knew we were going to be doing this podcast, we are going to have this conversation, I rewatched The Fountain. And you know what? That filled me with such joy because it felt so somewhat aligned with, I guess, where I am in my spiritual journey. But then with the ending of The Fountain, I thought, no, I am not here. No. So it's interesting because I think Aronofsky is on a very interesting journey here.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure which direction he's going in, if it's backwards, forwards, or you know what, time doesn't even exist. So, but he's on a journey.
Yeah. No,
yeah.
And I think that is completely fair. And I love that you're so open about how, well, I'm not sure how I feel anymore, and that was the thing that I was going to bring that up because of the fact that about your top 50 list, because it's like I was surprised there was not an Aronofsky film on there, and especially Black Swan, because I know from seeing you talk about it online that was a movie that, yes, you very much had a connection to. And yeah, I think that's completely, I think that is completely valid, and this is going to make this an interesting conversation, and one that I'm really excited to have, even more so than I was already excited to have it. So what was your first experience with Aronofsky? Was it Pi?
No. So guess what? I still have not seen Pi. I have not seen, and I love Pi. You know that. You know I love Pi, but I have not seen this Pi. I think I need a movie night, Pi with Pi. That's what I need. But I have a feeling, I'm actually really curious because I wonder if that might resonate with me the most. I wonder. Going backwards. So I think my first Aronofsky experience, Requiem for a Dream.
Wow.
Oh my God, I need to get that out of my head. I thought it was very bold, and it's a brilliant movie. I mean, no doubt, it's a brilliant movie.
Yeah.
It's a tough watch. It's very tough watch. And something I'm noticing now, what I'm really noticing, which perhaps I really didn't see with Black Swan, is there's this fascination with toxic characters.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess that's only hitting me now. And it's strange. It's making me feel weird.
Yeah.
Because when I watched The Whale, I was like, ooh, this is so toxic. I don't think I could ever watch this again.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's a brilliant movie. I mean, I will say Darren Aronofsky's work, I do find it's brilliant. The films are brilliant. But The Whale, gosh, I'd never watch that again. And Requiem for a Dream, no way. These are characters that are deeply rooted in trauma, grief, amongst other things. I think
that is completely true. I think that is completely true. I can't imagine starting with Requiem for a Dream. That is. I mean, I agree with you. It's a brilliant film, but it is one of those films where you just watch once and you're like, okay, I'm done. I think it's a great movie. I'm never watching it again. There are films that are like that, and it's because of how much of a shock to the system they are, because of how unrelenting they are in portraying that level of toxicity. And I think I think that is definitely one of the things that my first experience was with Pi. Actually, I saw that in 1998. I actually saw it at the Plaza in 1998.
Amazing.
With my mom. And she is like, yeah, no, I hated that movie. So, but it doesn't surprise me she didn't like that movie. But
Mhm.
I'll be curious to see what you think of Pi when you do get to
Mhm.
it. Um, but yeah, I mean, Pi, Requiem for a Dream. It's like I think one of the things that you can definitely see in Aronofsky is there's always a challenging of storytelling technique that he's trying to
Yeah.
do, especially with filmmaking, but also with the way he tells his story. And
Mhm.
you definitely get that with Requiem for a Dream. You get that with the three films that we're talking about today, and it's really a rich, even if it's an experience we don't necessarily feel like we want to have again. It's
Yeah.
I feel like it's a rich experience, and I think that is completely. I think that's an interesting experience to have and to give ourselves at times.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. You know what? It's had we been having this conversation prior to 2020, I think I'd still be very much like, oh, I love Aronofsky and oh my gosh, he's amazing. And I think I have changed. I think
Yeah.
his work is still brilliant. But I think, for example, you know me, we talk, you see my social media stuff, and I avoid toxicity now. So anything that is toxic, I will move away from. And I think the characters portrayed in Aronofsky's work, they just do not resonate. And I think for the same reason, Black Swan, I still love, but it just doesn't resonate as much anymore.
Hmm.
It
Yeah.
kind of makes me sad to say.
I mean, it's and that's. But I mean, you're getting to something that I certainly find fascinating when it comes to films, especially as we've really started to get the especially as we start to get the veil pulled off of some of the iconic filmmakers and how toxic, how just plainly misogynistic during
Mm,
and just how relentlessly off-putting their personal behavior is. How
mhm.
do we reconcile our respect for what respect we had for their work with who that person is?
Yeah.
And this is something I've definitely wrestled with some of my favorite people who've long been some of my favorite filmmakers and some of my favorite creators of all time. And I'm still wrestling with every time I watch their film. And
Yeah.
it's one of those things where it's just, and I think if there's a wrong way to approach that, it's to simply ignore it, to sweep under the rug. But other if away from that, like, definitive way of approaching it, I think any other approach, so long as you're taking that into consideration, I think
Mm.
wherever you land is just completely based on who you are as an individual.
Yeah, yeah. You know what? Every time I talk about my favorite movies, Brian, it always breaks my heart that I cannot include Kill Bill in like my top 50. I mean, it would have to be in my top 20, but I just don't put it in there because my biggest breakup, as you know, was with Tarantino.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's so difficult. I still grieve that. In
Yeah,
fact, I was talking about it this week, and I was just like, I'm so broken about that. But at the same time, like in my top 20 films, I have Polanski's Rosemary's Baby, and it's just like, oh.
yeah,
Yeah. I mean, I
yeah.
got to pick one. I can't have them all, so.
No, it's
Yeah.
it's it's difficult. I mean, it really comes down to the emotional connection that we have to those films. And it's like there's sometimes where those films just have too much of a personal connection to us that it's
Mhm.
almost impossible to break. And I mean,
Yeah.
the reason I wanted to write music is James Horner's score for Braveheart, made by
Mhm.
a pretty reprehensible human being. But I still love that film and I still love that score. And it's
Yeah.
like I have a hard time reconciling between the two. And
Mhm.
it's just one of those things. And I mean, I think you and I both talked about over on social media Buffy the Vampire Slayer with everything that's come out with Whedon. And it's like, Buffy is formative for me. And it's like, now, when I did a rewatch a few years ago, was after his ex-wife came out with her op-ed. And by that point, I'd started to, so that was before everything came out as far as Justice League and stuff like that. So it's like, I'd already started to drop him off that pedestal that I had him on. And, you know, what occurred to me during that rewatch of Buffy is that it was so much more than just his work. It's like you see the other writers who were part of that. You look at the actors, you look at what they brought. It's such a collection of talent that brought those stories to life. And so it's one name might stand out more than the rest, but it's not just that one name that is responsible for the success of the whole thing.
Yeah, absolutely. That's been an interesting one, because I think 2 years ago, 2 years ago, I actually gave away my Buffy box set because I thought, you know what? I'm never going to watch these again. They've served me. So it's honoring the fact that they served me when I was a teenager. I absolutely loved them. You know, I don't regret. I mean, I didn't know then. None of us did. And you look at these things and I think, as long as you know that it served you what you needed, it gave you that. But then it's kind of no longer, for me, it's like, well, I'm not going to buy any more Buffy merch or anything like that, you know? That's kind of how I approach these things. I don't want to feed more money into that machine.
Yeah.
But I'm still very grateful for what it gave me at the time.
Yeah. I mean, and again, it's that it comes to that personal journey that we have with art. And it's like, I know the first film that we're talking about here, which we're just going to go in chronological order, with 2006's The Fountain, was definitely a film for me that I resonated hard with in 2006. And I mean, part of that was because of the fact that I was still very much struggling with, first of all, I was still struggling to acknowledge my personal issues with anxiety and with depression. I recognized I was depressed. I recognized that I was anxious about a lot of things in my life, but at the same time, I wasn't quite sure how to put that into words, and much less be comfortable putting that into words. And, you know, it's like I was still, you know, my grandfather had passed away 6 years before, and he meant so much to me. And this was one of those films where, because of the fact that this deals with life and death so much, and the fact that it deals with the struggle we have when it comes to being confronted with death and trying to do something for the people that we love whom are dying, it really resonated with me in a profound way. And you know, this is a movie that I have absolutely loved since the first time I saw it, and every time I go back to it, and every time I listen to Clint Mansell's score, oh my holy God. This was Clint Mansell, Kronos Quartet, Mogwai. Oh my dear God, this score just impacts me in so many big ways when I listen to it. Did you see this one in theaters?
I did not. So first of all, Brian, I'm so sorry to hear about your grandfather, and thank you for sharing that with me. I did not see this in the movie theater. I saw this way after Black Swan because I wanted to check out more of Aronofsky's work. So I then got the film on DVD. And when I bought it on DVD, I imagine it would have been about maybe about 10 years ago. I watched it then, and then I finally watched it for a second time just a couple of months ago. I mean, it's a pretty heavy topic,
Yeah.
and a very beautiful, poetic film, which I don't want to like overwatch, if you get what I mean.
Yeah.
And yeah, soundtrack is amazing. It's really beautiful. I actually don't recall much about the first time I watched it. I was a very different person then, so but watching it now, it was again really beautiful, but very sharply contrasting again with my beliefs on life and death. And again, you get that kind of character who's struggling with grief, and there's trauma and there's guilt, and it's sad.
Yeah.
It's a very sad movie, because I feel like it reaches these amazing cosmic places where people, I'm sure they dream and aspire to be, but because it's an Aronofsky film, perfection isn't perfection. Perfection is like it's a double-edged sword, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think this. I think part of the reason this movie has always been so fascinating to me is because of the fact that it sets up. It's really about storytelling in a lot of different ways, and about two different ways of storytelling. Like, Tom is very scientifically minded. It's hard for him to kind of grasp the mystical ideas of life. He's more about scientific exploration, and Izzy, the Rachel Weisz character, is about storytelling, and it's like is about connecting with myth, connecting with time and space in that matter. And I love that the film really touches. I do feel like, especially this past time, it'd been several years since I had seen The Fountain. I can't remember the last time I had seen it, but I love that this movie deals a lot with it. It seems very structured with regards to Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief. Like, at the very beginning, you have the conquistador who really is dealing with denial, with anger, and just trying to make things right, very much in the same way that Tom is. But Tom is doing it in terms of, he's taking chances with his career, he's taking chances with his work in a way that speaks to how we bargain when it comes to being confronted by death. And it's like, well, what can I do to change this? And then the depression he feels after he realizes he cannot save Izzy. And then, of course, the very end with the nebula. And I love that it's 3 different time. It's set in 3 very different time periods, but all of them are about telling the same story in very similar ways, and all speak to the characters in a very particular way. And the nebula is ultimately about acceptance. And finally, he accepts what has happened. He accepts the death, and we get death is the and we get him basically facing awe, and basically the acceptance of death and the acceptance of what comes next and moving on from death.
It's interesting because that ending is it almost becomes quite like in the horror movie territory of like body horror, and in a way it saddens me because I think maybe there could have been a different slant to it, because I do love that ending, but it becomes almost quite horrific, whereas it could have been a very beautiful thing. The same thing happening, but a more of a surrender.
Right.
Rather than this kind of mutant growth thing happening. So yeah, I have trouble with the ending. Now, what I will say is, let's talk about Rachel Weisz. So a lot of Rachel Weisz's early movies, I adore her. So her character as Izzy in this is just amazing. What a wonderful character, a story within a story. So good. And I often find so three of my favorite Rachel Weisz roles, she tends to occupy these spaces of time and space. So we've got her in The Fountain, in Constantine. You know, so before she gets all kind of straight-headed cop, she was a sidekick. She was a powerful sidekick. She just kind of kept that part of herself hidden. And if we look at her role in The Mummy and The Mummy Returns, she has that connection to ancient Egypt. So it's so interesting to see her occupy these roles. It's fascinating to me. Her as a person in these roles, there's something there. It needs to be investigated.
Well, and you know, you bring that up. It really makes me think that you know, I've been fascinated by Andrew Garfield in kind of the same way, where it's like whether you're looking at him in Silence, whether you're looking at him in that main series that was on FX, and I can't remember what the name is off the top of my head, and then you see him as Jim Baker in the Tammy Faye movie, and it's like, okay, and then Hacksaw Ridge, and it's like he's got some very interesting faith adjacent films here. It's like, I'd be curious to see what him and Aaron. I'd almost be very curious to see him in Aronofsky because of the fact that Aronofsky approaches faith and religion in very particular ways too, that I think would make for an interesting collaboration. But yeah, I mean,
absolutely.
I completely forgot Rachel Weisz was in Constantine. Makes me want to rewatch that film at some point. Which I want to anyway, because it's a terrific film.
I've seen it more than 100 times. In fact, I think I've got a little Constantine. Yeah, I've got a collectible behind me, so I managed to source that recently from eBay. So,
but no, this is a movie where it's like, yeah, that ending I had forgotten. It'd been so long since I had seen the movie when I rewatched it for getting ready for this episode that I'd forgotten just how almost body horror, like you said, that the ending gets. I also kind of forgot how sudden the movie is in terms of its ending. It's like, oh wow, I forgot it. I mean, I remember the basic place it went. I remember the basic way it went. I completely forgot like the ins and outs of, you know, how it gets to that ending. But it's because I've seen hundreds of other movies in between, and so it's like it all kinds of blur. But The Fountain is something where it's like I've always it kind of reminds me in a way, in the way it deals with time and space. It does kind of remind me of Cloud Atlas in a lot of ways. I mean, I know we've talked about that movie at times as well, and you know, I mean, this one is more. This one is not as more rooted with, I guess, symbolic connections that Cloud Atlas is. This one is dealing with more literal connections in terms of this story is part of this story. This story is, you know, and then you kind of realize, oh, the book is that Izzy is writing is about the conquistador and all of that. And then the last chapter is essentially what Tom is going to add on. Like that's how I've always it occurred to me. It's like, oh, that's how it always made sense to me. It's like, well, she wants him to write the last chapter, so last chapter is more of this dealing with this nebula, Zabalba, and you know, is more scientifically is trying to reconcile the scientific and the spiritual in a way.
Yeah.
That's how I've always kind of looked at that one.
It's interesting because I love that you just brought up the Cloud Atlas. I adore the Wachowskis. I recently finally watched Sense8 on Netflix, and I thought, oh my gosh, people have been recommending me that series for ages, but nobody mentioned it was directed by the Wachowskis. The moment I found out, I was like, right, I'm on this. Now, it's interesting. It's so interesting. If we compare the Wachowskis to somebody like Darren Aronofsky, now I feel like the Wachowskis really do focus on a lot of spiritual work. A lot of their sources, I feel, comes from ancient and revered Indian classical texts like the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads, which I've had the pleasure of reading. I've read both, and I remember I knew somebody a long time ago who said who grew up with those texts and said, "Well, isn't Cloud Atlas like the Bhagavad Gita 101?" I said, "Yeah, but that's your culture. You grew up with this. The Western world, not so much." So, and I find with the Wachowskis, you get this sense of hope. You get characters that I think you genuinely really like.
Yeah.
That connected, search for connection, and there is joy. It's soulful, and I think in contrast to that, Darren Aronofsky's work is this almost this frustrated search for perfection, and almost this greed comes in. And I found that also with Black Swan towards the end, this greed, this alter ego, this greed comes in. And we also see this with the end of The Fountain with Tom, when he finds a tree and he's kind of taking it in, and then he wants so much of it, and he's like consuming this liquid, this stuff coming out, to the point where it's almost like it appears like it's poisoning his body. He's growing out of it. Stuff is growing out of him, sorry. And there's this idea presented in a lot of Aronofsky's work of excess. We see it in Requiem of a Dream, excess. We see this in The Fountain at the end. The excess in searching for perfection in Black Swan, and of course we definitely see it in The Whale.
Yes.
Oh, not to forget Mother, the excessive chaos. And Mother is another film where when it was released and I saw it in the movie theater, I loved it. Oh my gosh, I thought, that's me. I mean, unfortunately my partner at the time was like, that's what it's like being with UK. So yeah, so now upon reflection, I'm like, actually, that was me.
Yeah.
But it's not me anymore.
Right.
It's not me anymore. Yeah, sometimes you got to just reel things in and have a good look at yourself. And I certainly did.
Aronofsky really, and that is a great way of putting it, because I do agree with you that so much of Aronofsky is about excess, and it's also, and going back to what you said earlier about how so many of his characters are toxic, in whether it is what they put into their body, whether it is how they approach life. It is so, and I mean, Tom is very much the same way. Like he should be caring more about Izzy and her final journey, but he has to hold on to her as opposed to letting go. And that is the thing that is so frustrating about him in this movie. Jackman plays it terrifically, and it's interesting because because this and The Prestige were basically out at exactly the same time. They very much touch on the same idea in Jackman's character in both movies. But yeah, and you look at
they really do.
it's been a while, and it's been a while since I've seen Black Swan. I don't think I've seen it since theaters, actually. But I definitely remember the obsession, the perfection in Black Swan. Yeah. I definitely remember it in The Wrestler. Noah, which I know you haven't seen, and I would be very
I've-
curious to see how you feel about it.
Mm.
Especially given how you feel about Aronofsky now. But as a fan of horror, I'd be very fascinated to see, because even though yes, it is based on a biblical story, it's also very much a horror story, and
Amazing.
it's fascinating to see the way that they portray Noah in that movie, and his obsession with hearing the voice of God telling him you must build this ark, but what that means. And it's when it gets on the ark after the flood is when that movie gets terrifying. And
Okay.
this is and like you said with Mother, I mean, is very much the same way. And we'll get to that. And I have so many thoughts about that. I know the first time I saw that, I don't know how I missed it. I don't know how I missed spoilers about Mother for 2 weeks before I saw it. But I did, and I regret nothing, because it was fascinating watching the audience, who probably was not as familiar with Aronofsky as I was, go, what the is this? And it's like, oh, this is Darren Aronofsky. Yeah.
Oh my God. I love that. That movie was just, you know what? It was, at the time, it was such a good indicator of how I felt. For example, when I was filming Black Lake, it's like, this is what is happening in my head all the time. This is the chaos. This is everything, all the thoughts, all the feelings I have to deal with as an artist happening in the rooms, the compartments in my head, and nobody can see it. Nobody can understand what I'm going through. And the one person I expect to be there, quite frankly, doesn't get it.
Yeah.
You know? And that at the time really resonated with me.
Mm-hmm.
That obsession of like, this is my baby. But at the same time, it's everybody's baby. So if you kind of go back to the baby scene in Mother, which was very haunting.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it made sense for me. It's like, I have produced this film. I'm talking about myself as a filmmaker. I have made this film, but it's not just for me. I have made this for everyone to partake in a very kind of the ending of Perfume. If you've seen that, right? It's very much like that, you know, if you think, if you link the ending of Perfume to Mother, taking that apart, it's like, well, I've made this for you. Mm-hmm. So some people can take it, some people can leave it. That's kind of how I view my work.
Yeah.
You know, it's such a sacred process. Yeah.
No, and it's funny because of the fact that, I mean, you know, if we want to, we can certainly go back to Mother, and we can start talking about Mother. That, you know, this is one of the things that fascinates me about Aronofsky, and that how he approaches religious ideas. Sometimes he approaches them from very metaphorical ideas, but sometimes he's also very direct, and I think there's a little bit of both in that when it comes to Mother. And this was my first, and watching this in preparation for this podcast was the first time I had seen it since theater, and I forgot and the thing that really strikes me, first of all, probably the best performance Jennifer Lawrence has given, I think.
Yeah.
She is absolutely amazing in this movie.
Oh, you mean Jennifer Lawrence, the first female action hero from Hunger Games, right?
Yes, evidently. Yeah. I mean, clearly Alien, you know, went to the future and took the idea. And,
absolutely.
You know,
I mean, you know, we were talking about time. It doesn't exist. So, yeah.
But
we can come out soon in theaters.
But no, I mean, the thing that is the thing that really connected with me so much about Mother in this one is that I feel like this film gets so much at the heart of what it is to be anxious just in life. If you feel anxious in life, but you're not quite sure how to say it, you're not quite sure how to get people to understand it. I feel like that's what this movie does.
From the perspective of Jennifer Lawrence's character?
Yes.
Do you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And especially when you have Javier Bardem's character, who's so very much in his own mind, like he's disregarding her turn after turn after turn. It's like, oh yeah, these people want to be here. These people want to, I want to help these people. It's like, well, what about me? And it's like, what about me? And I feel you feel so much for Lawrence's character in this movie.
That's so interesting you say that, Brian, because okay, so now now I want to watch it again, just because when I first watched it, I heavily resonated with Bardem's character, right? Mm-hmm. I haven't even thought about this perspective. Because at the time I watched it in the movie theaters, I was doing Black Lake, right? And the way I saw all the other characters coming in, like Michelle Pfeiffer's character, I didn't actually see them as physical people coming into the house. It's almost like if he's writing a story, these are characters.
Right.
And it's like she's competing against characters in his art, his making, How fascinating.
Well, the thing
heavy stuff.
well, the thing is, it's like, one of the things I think is, going back to the fountain for a second, it's like the first thing we see on screen is a biblical passage about Garden of Eden, the tree of life. So you kind of get the idea that these characters in a way are very much Aronofsky and Adam and Eve, like Tom and Lizzie are in a way are his representation of Adam and Eve. But in Mother you kind of get that as well, but in a very different perspective, and it's almost like but you also get Cain and Abel. I mean, part of that probably comes from him. And one of the things that I read about Aronofsky is that he's always, while he's culturally Jewish, he's never really had a particular spiritual connection to Judaism, but he's always been fascinated about religion in general. And
that's so interesting. I didn't know that. And I think that's interesting because I think that disconnection really shows. There's this curiosity, and that disconnection really shows. And you kind of comparing these characters to biblical characters, it makes me think about Black Swan again. We've again with the Adam and Eve, like with Vincent Cassell's character and Natalie Portman's. But then you've also got this Lilith character played by Mila Kunis, the actual Black Swan. Yeah. That's interesting, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But, and it's like with Mother, it's funny that film, it very much takes its time building up, but it also is moving at a pretty breakneck pace. So it's got that duality of time and how it's approaching storytelling in the movie. I mean, it's not exactly the same in The Fountain. The Fountain is very deliberately paced that way, but with Mother, it's like you've got this, that's where the sense of anxiety you really start to feel with it, because of the fact that it's like one after another, each situation just building on each situation. And especially when Ed Harris and Michelle Pfeiffer's kids come in, and it's like the brother kills the other brother. It's like, that's where the Cain and Abel part comes in. It's like, oh, well, very obviously this is where this is happening. But it's just a very, everything is happening, and just it's hard for Lawrence's character to keep up with it, and nobody's listening to her. I mean, one of the connections I've seen to of the reads I've seen on this movie, it's mother versus, and everybody else's humanity and basically destroying the environment. It's basically this biblical sense of duty to the earth that Aronofsky. This is part of why I'd be curious to see what you'd think of Noah, because it's kind of in that environmental way, but not in the preachy type of, but in a very different way than you would expect normal. It's not a strict climate change screed, but it's approaching it from almost a terrifying perspective.
It's interesting you say that, because again, it takes you back to the finale of The Fountain.
Yeah,
with the earth taking, I guess, what it's owed, in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
So that will be an interesting thing to compare it to. Yeah.
It's like this was I know with Mother, it's like it's one of those things where there's a lot of ideas in it when it comes to the idea of cults, and it's like Bardem basically becomes this cult figure which all of these people gravitate towards because of his writing. And it's funny because God. I messaged you as I was watching it, and it was because of the baby scene at the end that's just absolutely mortifying to watch. And I'm like, how did this came out like right before QAnon had already happened? How did this not get pulled into the whole QAnon modern satanic panic we're dealing with now, where all these people think, oh, Hollywood's so satanic and all of that stuff? And it's like, really? How? But it's like, that would have been exhibit A for me if you're making a case for it.
I think really, I think it's an interesting comparison to use that kind of physical birth, that baby, and then also be talking about art, because that's really what art is. Art. My movies are my children. I don't plan to have children ever, but there's this connection here,
Mm-hmm.
And I think what Mother does it in a very visceral, uncomfortable way.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because for me, Mother really, I'm not surprised it did so badly. It's because I really felt it was a film about art and artists for other artists.
Yeah.
I didn't really think it was a film for the general audience.
Mm-hmm.
I guess in a similar way, I think every now and again, a director will just do something they really want to express, I thought it was fascinating for Aronofsky to cast Jennifer Lawrence.
Yeah.
A very bold choice. But I also remember thinking, when I first watched Mother, it's like they took the blueprint of Black Swan, placed it over Mother, and then added to it.
Yeah.
That's what it felt like to me.
Mm-hmm. And it's like you do have this sense of, you really do have this sense of Aronofsky's work in a way, building from like one film to another film into another film. I mean, I know you haven't seen Pi. I know you haven't seen Noah. Have you seen The Wrestler?
I have not. No.
Oh, really? Okay. So The Wrestler, in a way, very much fits in. All of his films very much fit into this continuum of just building upon ideas that he did before, and whether it's bringing in stylistic flourishes, whether it's bringing in narrative flourishes, whether it's bringing in metaphorical flourishes, he really is building to these ideas of trying to, like you said, trying to figure out trying to questioning where life goes in a lot of ways, and how people react to life. And I think that was I think that is one of the things that struck me so much. And it was basically because by 2017 I was very consciously aware of my own emotional journey when it comes to anxiety. I mean, I've been in therapy for almost a decade by that point, and I was very confident to acknowledge it's like, this is what I've gone through, and this is why I go through times. And so, being able to recognize that in Mother and how what Aronofsky does in that film, which resonates with me because of the fact that he approaches it in this almost apocalyptic manner, is so fascinating. That's what makes him such a compelling filmmaker for me. Where it's like, there are some of his films I may never watch again. I mean, we talked about Requiem for a Dream earlier, and it's like Mother. I don't know how many more times I would necessarily watch that movie, but I can definitely say I look back on it and it's like, okay, but I'm glad that I had that experience because of the fact that I'm glad somebody was able to put that experience on screen in a way that resonated with me.
Yeah. Well, talking more and more about this, Brian, I'm actually realizing I think the issue that Aronofsky's characters face is that they all have a clear lack of boundaries. And this is something I've only learned in the last year is to how to set boundaries and practice setting them. So if we, Requiem for a Dream, Mother, Black Swan, The Whale, if these characters had a sense of integrity and were able to set boundaries, maybe their fates could have been different. But there is a clear lack of them here, which enables other things to play out.
Well, and it's interesting because of the fact that, I mean, I do think there's some truth to that, but I also think there's also a sense that getting out of there are some characters, I mean, especially when you do watch Pi, I think one of the things you'll kind of notice is the main character in Pi almost is afraid to get away, to push his boundaries of the way the world works. He's very focused in his particular way of looking at the world. But, what's interesting about The Whale for me is that I very much felt like Charlie is somebody who is very aware of how he got where he is. And he's almost accepting of it in a way that you wish he wasn't, but you also kind of understand why he is.
Yeah. No, that's the problem, you see. That's the problem. So I think we're all familiar with people in our lives or people we've come across who are like, that's just how I am.
Yeah.
And I think that's such a sad and toxic thing to say. That's just how I am. I have this trauma, this awful thing happened to me, and that's just how I am. That's why I am this person. And it's like, well, but you have this awareness, you know why you are this way, but it is your duty, I guess, to yourself to help yourself to come out of that. That's just because you know why, like you're not destined to stay in that state. He makes no effort to kind of overcome. And I guess if he does at all in The Whale, he does it for his daughter. But again, it's that kind of having to come back to yourself. You do things for yourself so you can be better for other people.
Yeah, exactly. No, and
he's so self-sacrificing and things, and it's just like, no, please don't be that self-sacrificing person. Just focus on yourself.
No, you're absolutely right. The thing that the way I looked at The Whale, especially the second time I watched it, because I did watch it again before.
Oh gosh, you watched it a second time?
It was a few months apart, but no, I mean, I had the screener, I had the 4-year consideration screener from A24, and it's like, I'm going to watch it again because I want to take notes for this discussion. I always try to rewatch stuff, even if it's relatively fresh in my head, because of the fact that it's like, I want to have notes for myself during these conversations. And the thing that hit me so, I mean, I talked about it in one of the things I did talk about in my review, my print review of The Whale, is how, it reminded me of a moment in my life where my mother's been overweight basically as long as I remember. And I made it aware to her at one point that I was ashamed of that. And, it made me this made the movie made me remember that. And it's like by this point, it's like that type of thinking has been out of sight, out of mind for me for decades. Because I was a teenager at the time, and it's like, when you're a teenager, you always have the wrong perspective on shit. I mean, I don't care how confident you are, you're probably wrong. But but the fact of the matter is, it's like one of the things that the whale brought up is that, it's like Charlie has this, he reminds me a lot of the Elephant Man. The movie really treats Charlie, I think, in the same way that David Lynch does the Elephant Man in that film. I mean, I think overall, I think the Elephant Man is a superior film. But I think the approach is the same, where it's about showing us the humanity of an individual who's, whether it's through any fault of their own, on the outside is grotesque. And, it's like, I think, I think that's where the performance by Fraser, it is genuinely a great performance because of the fact that even if Charlie is toxic, which he is, because he does manipulate things in a lot of ways to his own benefit.
Toxic positivity,
yeah,
which I only learned was a thing 2 years ago, and I was like, oh my gosh, I've experienced this. So there was a lot there. My gosh.
But it's like, and you look at Ellie, you look at Sadie Sink's character, and she's a bitch, but it's like at the same time, like Charlie feels like, well, he feels like she's probably this way because of what I did, and maybe I can help her get past that and start to see past the way she has felt. And I think, again, we're talking about, again, I've talked about, Aronofsky and Faith. It's like Ty Simpkins' character is a fascinating way of approaching that because of the fact that he's basically an evangelist. He's a missionary, and it's like he's trying to help Charlie as much as possible. He wants to help Charlie as much as possible. And then when we find out the truth about him, it's like most of the people here, several of the main characters in this film are lying to the audience and to a certain extent lying to themselves.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, Liz is really the only one. The Hong Chow character is really the only one who's as honest as anybody can be.
Yeah, yeah. But as brilliant as she is, there's still this sense of enabling, and that just made me really, really sad. I do wanted to point out, I think it's absolutely interesting how Brendan Fraser won Best Actor for this, and how Natalie Portman won Best Actress for Black Swan.
Yeah.
In 2011, both Aronofsky films, both pretty toxic characters, I guess. So, maybe we are drawn. I mean, it took me a long time to recognize that Natalie Portman's character was, to an extent, toxic, as were many of the characters in that movie. I think it depends on what stage we are in our lives.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I'm using the word toxic a lot, but at the same time, these characters are very human. Mm-hmm. They are portraying very human experiences, and they are very complex people. I've been there, and I think where I'm now, where I'm very grateful and blessed to be, is I'm standing outside of that, and I'm looking in, and I'm able to say, you know what, these films are absolutely brilliant. These characters are so interesting, but they do not resonate with me anymore. And that's a good thing.
It is a good thing.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, and yeah, I mean, that's the thing. It's like, you know, the ability to say, okay, this served, like you said earlier, this served its purpose for me for a time. It doesn't anymore. You know, I mean, think about, think about Charlie in The Whale and the fact that for him to calm down, he goes back to this book report that Ellie wrote about Moby Dick. And that's how that's how he's able to calm down after a heart attack, after a stroke. And, it's like, okay, that's fine. But what could help you is if you actually got help. But, the thing is, it's like you're absolutely right. It is really a sense of toxic positivity, while also, it's also a sense of self-loathing as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It all boils down to that. And I must say, when I went to the LFF screening of The Whale, having Samuel Hunter there talk about the film, because it's actually based on his experience, was really fascinating. And that's why I have some love for the film. I was so pleased to see Samuel Hunter there looking healthy, talking about his experience, standing there alive. And it's like, wow, you did it. You purged yourself. Yeah.
Because it is not easy. And it's like and it's like, you were talking about, one of the things you were talking about just a few minutes ago. You were saying, about some of these characters just accepting who they are. This is who I am. On the one hand, there's a good way. It's fine to have that level of self-awareness, but at the same time, do you have enough self-awareness to realize that sometimes the way you are is not necessarily a good thing? And, it's like that because of the fact that some people don't. It's like one of my very best friends sometimes has that feeling, and it's like, oh, it breaks my heart because of the fact that it's like, you're capable of so much more. You're capable of being so much more. And it's like, if you would just let go of some of this that you have. I mean, some of it is the situation that they're in, but at the same time, it's like, it's fine to accept yourself as who you are to an extent, but if that involves blaming other people for your issues, that's not necessarily a good thing. I mean, even to a certain extent, I mean, even Liz, even Hong Chau's character in the movie, she, to a certain extent, she holds on too much to the fact that her father's religious upbringing is ultimately what killed her brother and Charlie's lover. And it's like, so that's part of the reason why. But at the same time, she also, I feel was like she tries to, that's also, I kind of feel like to a certain extent, that's her way of trying to alleviate Charlie of some of his own guilt that he might have over things as well.
Yeah. It's interesting because it's like all of these Aronofsky characters, it's like they are all searching for the light.
Yeah.
Okay. They're all, whether it's the spotlight in Black Swan or the light that when you finish a piece of art, or like we see at the end of The Whale, the lights. They're all searching for the light. But it's like they are, and again in The Fountain, but it's like they are dragged down by the human experience of, this is just who I am. I am actually human. There's this desire to be so much more, to want to achieve more. this curiosity about a god or a spirituality, but these characters always get dragged back down by the human experience of shame, of guilt, of obsession,
Yeah.
which is a theme that runs across all of Darren Aronofsky's work.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's kind of it's fascinating, but it's also sad a little bit, because I'm so curious to know what his next movie is going to be like. I almost want him to do a little bit better for himself, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I feel like with The Whale, it just went so much in a direction that was like quite far away from The Fountain. So this is why I'm really interested in seeing Pi. I want to see where that falls on that spectrum of, The Fountain and then something like The Whale.
It's like Pi is a movie that I respect more than I overly love it. I did love it at the time when I saw it in 98, but looking at it now, when did I see it last? I think it was probably like 12, 13 years ago or something like that, that I last saw it. It's a movie that I respect. I respect the technique. I respect the storytelling style that he approaches, that utilizes, and the way that he tells that story. It's not necessarily something that I think quite engages me emotionally, especially the same way these three films did. And but I think it's him very much. It does kind of very much feel like a student film. I think that's one of the comments my mom made when we watched the movie, and more I, looking at his work over the years, I can kind of see where she's coming from with that. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but the point is, it's a filmmaker who's kind of like figuring himself out, and the fact that he made a movie is still low key, relatively speaking, but also challenging as Requiem for a Dream next is a big swing, because of the fact that it's like, that's not, I mean, that is a movie about how addiction just takes you over the edge, and just that need for that chemical dependency of something to keep you going, and how it wrecks you. And it's like that is just a hard thing to get through. And then, but I think that's part of the reason why, to a certain extent, The Fountain, I mean, you're absolutely right when it comes to Tom, but one of the things I think is so beautiful about The Fountain comparatively to most of his work is the fact that it's like, Tom eventually, it takes him too long, but he eventually gets to that point of acceptance, of realizing, I cannot control everything. I wish I could. I can't. And in order to do what I can to keep my wife's spirit alive, this is how I'm going to approach doing that moving forward. I think that's where I'm ultimately more hopeful about The Fountain than I am a lot of Aronofsky's work.
So that's the thing. I think similarly, but then the way that The Fountain ends, I'm almost left disappointed with Tom's character, because there's that greed that sets in of wanting more and bringing him almost back down to earth, of like, oh my gosh, I found it, the Holy Grail. And then he wants so much of it. It transforms him in a kind of grotesque, scary body horror way.
Yeah.
So it's like, he gets to that point, but he lets it slip. And I think I'm kind of left at the end of The Fountain with this sadness of, oh my gosh, you had it. You had it,
Yeah.
But then he became human again. And he lost it. So, yeah. Yeah.
I have to say this conversation has been everything that I hoped it would be, and then some. And it's because of the fact that you and I have approached Aronofsky's work so differently over the years and have such different, varying ideas of his work because of the way it's connected with us over the years. It's made this conversation even richer. I think that I ever could have expected, and I appreciate you bring up his work as a conversation point for us.
I must say, there's one person I have not mentioned yet, and I'm ashamed to say I've left it this late in the conversation. Satoshi Kon. I'm a huge Satoshi Kon fan. Huge Satoshi Kon fan.
Yeah.
So one of the reasons I love Black Swan is because there are segments of that taken straight out of Perfect Blue.
Oh yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
with Requiem for a Dream. Now, at this point, I thought maybe he's paying homage or something, but I realized he's actually just he's just lifting those scenes.
Yeah.
He doesn't have direct permission. So I think at that point, I started becoming kind of a little bit detached from Aronofsky's work. Because I think with my work, I always say I am paying homage. You can see in my list of end credits, my thank yous, names are right there. Like, thank you to this director, thank you to this person. So I'm not too sure about how I feel about Satoshi Kon's work being basically a blueprint reference for some of the scenes.
I think that is completely fair. I mean, if you listen to my discussion on Satoshi Kon's work from a couple of years ago, you know how much I absolutely adore his work. I mean, Perfect Blue is one of the greatest films I've ever seen. It's such a tremendous film. But I completely understand that too. I definitely, it's like, I mean, yeah, on the one hand, you can see the comparison, but it's like, especially if you read that, it's like, well, he's kind of wanting to do his own version of Perfect Blue, but it's like he's doing that by lifting ideas for his own films. How do you feel about that?
Well, that's probably why Black Swan came out of my top 50.
Yeah.
Because I had obviously Perfect Blue there, right?
Yeah.
In my top 15 movies. And for me, it was like, whoa, I can't have them in the same list.
Yeah.
Perfect Blue is by far more superior, right? And it does so, I'm not left watching Perfect Blue thinking, oh, what a toxic character. Like, Perfect Blue is just so riveting and complex and rich in many different ways to Black Swan. I mean, I still have a lot of love for Black Swan, but it's not Perfect Blue.
It's and it's one of those things where it's sort of like what we were talking about earlier when it comes to filmmakers whose personal lives just really make it hard to reconcile our love of their art with them and with who they are. And I mean, I think it, in a way, especially is very similar when you are dealing with a film that so very directly connects with another thing that you genuinely love. And it's like, you can tell that the influence is there, but it's like, well, are they doing this because of the fact that they love it the same way I do, or are they doing it for a different reason? And I think that is, I think that's part of the reason why, that's part of the reason why some of the movies that I love are some of the movies I love. There are some of the reason why some of the other movies that I don't love are movies that I don't love. It's part of the reason why it's part of the reason why, while I understand why a lot of people love The Matrix, I can't divest myself from the fact that Dark City came first, approached those same subjects in a way that I thought was better. And so it's like, I've come to respect The Matrix now more, but I will never love it as much as I do Darkseid, because I saw Darkseid first, and Darkseid excited me in a way that The Matrix ultimately didn't. And so I think it's one of those things where when it comes to art and artists, it also you look at how they are inspired by the things that they are inspired by. And you kind of look at I mean, I'm gonna bring it up because it's on my brain, but it's it kind of makes me think of the Star Wars sequel trilogy. And which I've talked about exhaustively on this podcast before. If you know me, you know how much I love The Last Jedi. You know how much I also don't really talk a lot about The Force Awakens and Rise of Skywalker. And it's because of the fact that I feel like what The Last Jedi is doing is so much more profound in how it approaches the ideas of Star Wars compared to just doing a carbon copy of what Star Wars has brought us before. And I think that's one of those things where it's like, and so I definitely understand where you're coming from when it comes to your love of Perfect Blue versus how you feel about Black Lake or Black Swan.
Black Swan.
Yeah, it's like but no, it's a fascinating discussion. It's always a fascinating discussion. I think it's one that, as moviegoers, I think everybody should have to a certain extent with some of the films that they love. And it's like, well, why do you love that? And it's like, well, what about, and it's like, oh, I love it because it reminds me of this. It's like, well, do you love it because do you love it as much because it reminds you of that, or do you kind of see some of the themes?
It's an interesting one. I think, my work obviously gets called Lynchian quite a lot, and everybody knows I love David Lynch, and I'm a huge Twin Peaks fan, hence the cherry pie and coffee. But I think what people perhaps know less is that I've been a Jungian since I was 11. I was reading Jung when I was 11, and I didn't discover Lynch till I was about 20, So when it comes to dream sequences and dream symbolism and psychology, the Jung stuff comes first.
Yeah.
That's my
exactly.
territory. So,
But Kay, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you, Brian. It has been an absolute pleasure.
I love this conversation. It is very different than we normally have on these discussions, and honestly, that's kind of what I was hoping for, and it certainly was that. So and we will definitely talk more in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing so much with me today, Brian. It's been amazing. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Kay for joining me on the podcast to talk about Aronofsky. It was a bit of a different way into that discussion than I'm used to, but was also one that I think really afforded us a chance to talk about our different perspectives on Aronofsky. And that's something that is not really, we don't really get a lot on this podcast. But that's part of the reason why I wanted to have Kay on, because I love talking to her about films. I think the way she approaches films, the way she approaches life is very particular, and it's very exciting. And if you get a chance to watch Maya at Salem Horror Fest or any other festival, take the chance to do so. You get a chance to see Black Lake Director's Cut next year, take the chance to do so. Her work is wonderful. That's going to be it for this episode of the Sonic Cinema Podcast. Thank you very much for Kay for joining me. Thank you very much for everybody who listens. Check us out wherever you listen to podcasts. Got great episodes coming up this summer, and this is going to be an exciting year for the podcast. And this puts to bed another conversation I was really looking forward to having, and really got excited about the way it turned out. So thank you very much for checking me out, and always check out my written work at www.sonic-cinema.com.